But Peter, to come back to something you touched on a moment ago, evidence. Why is it that evidence doesn't bite anymore? For example, look, on every indicator, the progressive worldview is not producing a greater degree of settledness, for want of a better word, of happiness, of contentment, of purpose. You've only got to look at the raw figures. In our country, anxiety and depression amongst our young people are at record levels. We have a terrible problem with youth suicide. Every piece of data you want to look at, trust in our institutions is smashed to the point where our democracy is being challenged. I could go on. We have serious issues, but no one will join up the dots. And one of the major sort of set of dots that needs to be joined up surely is that despite what the aggressive secular humanists are telling us, this is getting worse the further we move away from our Christian cultural roots.
Well, I can't say very much about your country because I know it only as an occasional visitor and someone who watches it from afar. I can say about this country that it's beyond doubt that the serious education of the young has pretty much ceased and has become instead a process by which people are taught what to think rather than how to think. So the simple ability to assess evidence doesn't really exist. And I don't make any exceptions here for our supposedly wonderful private schools, which have also sunk hugely in quality over the past 30 or 40 years, and also which are full of left-wing teachers, just as the state schools are, which is a thing which many of the parents who fork out hundreds of thousands of pounds for what they think is going to be a good conservative education don't realise until it's too late. So I think if you have an ill-educated population, then it's going to be incapable of taking any serious interest in evidence. And that's a starting point for any argument on this. Most people just don't know what they're talking about, and they have no idea how to think or how to debate. The number of people who think that, for instance, if they are rebutted in a debate, they don't have to either put forward their own rebuttal or acknowledge what's been said, is astonishing. It's so rare in any public place to encounter anybody who you can debate with who responds. You might as well not have said what you said. That's not it. We simply failed to educate people in the most basic processes of discovering what is and isn't true. So they don't know. And also, there's another thing. This is an age of faith, but without a religious faith to belong to. The whole climate change movement is a faith. It has all the characteristics, in some ways, almost of a cult. It's impossible to argue with its devotees. And if you raise even the slightest stats, even if you say, which is often my approach towards things of this kind, look, you may be right. I'm perfectly prepared to accept that you are right, but at the moment you don't seem to me to have proved it beyond all reasonable doubt. That's not enough.
No.
Only submission is enough, in which is quite similar to Islam, which also believes very much in submission. If you submit, that's okay. Otherwise, you're a denier, and actually, denier is a new word for heretic. Heretic now is a joke word, which isn't used seriously and doesn't do you any damage. But to be called a denier with the insidious connotation of your being equated with the Holocaust denier is devastating. And it's meant to be.
Well,
the thing is that it is based on a belief in benevolence. The people and all the most dangerous thought systems they're based on a belief in that if you follow that particular belief, then good results will follow. And so it's unassailable in the person who thinks that it makes him or her morally good to believe this thing.
You raise there really the issue of the way we decimate people who dare to question the orthodoxy of the day, whether it's climate change or whether it's gender politics or whatever. Coming to our universities, which we've traditionally looked to as places that will equip our leaders, if you like, our most talented to take us forward. But what seems to be happening so much now, it's not just that they're only getting a narrow diet, even that courses are designed to avoid offence rather than the challenge. And that part of that might be described as this commitment to an empathy culture where you have to show sympathy for victims. And if you don't sympathise with them, you're a hater or you're a bigot or you're a homophobe or worse.
Well, I suppose all these things are just ways of saying that disagreement is morally wrong and dissent from the accepted set of opinions on these things is morally wrong, and that the person who does it is to be ostracised.
But there seems to be two really difficult flow-on problems. The first is that empathy squeezes out reason and rational debate, because there may be times when, if I disagree with you, it doesn't mean that I hate you. It might even mean that I love you.
You're arguing apparently from a premise that the other side are going to be distressed if rational debate disappears. And that's your mistake. They're not going to be distressed if rational debate disappears.
That in itself is a very profound reality we need to come to grips with. Because
they don't want it.
So why have we retreated from reason? We've been over that ground. It's a rhetorical question. But we need to understand how dangerous it is. The other point, though, that arises out of it is that how do we find our way forward if we're simply unable to argue our own case in the face of somebody who might disagree? And I'm thinking of Brexit. When we're simply unable to recognise what the Quakers might have called the spark of the divine in the other, in other words, to recognise something good in them, how can you ever negotiate a way forward if there's no essential respect for the other person or their position?
Probably you can't, and that's another thing that you cease to. If you cease to recognise humanity in the other person, then in the end you'll seek to destroy. And this is why I am worried that this episode won't just end and leave us with our political system intact, but a few bruised egos and some probably quite minor changes in our relations with the European Union. But at the end of it, we will have had such a huge constitutional and political crisis that we will no longer be able to sustain our political system as it is, because it was based so much on old rules of civility and treating the other side as if they were human. And these aren't sustainable anymore, either within the political parties or between them, and it's gone.
Now, Peter,
whether these things are gone, you can spend hundreds of years creating taboos or customs of behaviour, and they can die in an afternoon.
Well, that appears to be what's happening, and that's why it's so
when they
concerning.
die, people realise when they die, gosh, that's a shame. Perhaps we can put it back, and then they find they can't put it back. Have you ever read any of the ghost stories of M.R. James?
No.
Well, they're almost all about people who take things out of places where they shouldn't have taken them out of, and then they can't put them back.
Well, Peter,
horrible things happen to them. Well, particular one called A Warning to the Curious, in which a lot is stated in the title.
There are two areas.
I recommend them. They're a very good lesson in many, many things. They're also a very good ghost story.
There are two areas where you've said a lot lately that seems to be deeply grounded in your commitment to evidence, and yet there's amazingly little traction on either in your country or in mine, as far as I can see. One is the issue of the gender pay gap.
Uh-huh.
And it does seem that this debate is characterised more by emotion than it is by evidence. You've recently pointed out that the way it's presented by feminists is often highly simplistic and misleading.
Well, it's not just me that points it out. And if I'd been prepared for this question, I could name the very clever woman at I think the Institute of Economic Affairs who does the research on this, who points out that the whole thing is misleading because it fails to take into account the very important influence which actually childbearing has on the pay of women, simply taken as being paid the same thing for the same job. Discrimination of that kind was more or less abolished years ago. The real problem lies in the fact that as long as women remain the principal carers of children, as soon as they enter into any kind of career where pay is incremental on the basis of the climb up the career ladder, then they will, on average, very quickly be found to be paid less. And that misleads about the nature of the problem. The nature of the problem is not of discrimination. The nature of the problem lies in the thing which we're not allowed to mention, which is that women are different from men.
One of the interesting subsets again of this is that the research here and in America show that there are now women who are graduating in greater numbers than young men. They're often doing so with better academic qualifications. They're actually getting the pick of the jobs. They're earning more, and then young men are left wondering what their role is.
Well, yes, I think that probably is the case. But again, even in that generation, the problem hits a wall when those women come to the point where they have to decide whether to have children or not.
The research again shows that despite what is said in the media and the public discourse around this area, that the great majority of people still enormously value the idea of not only bringing their own children into the world, but doing it well and spending time with them.
It's not an argument I would counter or contest, but it's one which you're not really allowed to speak out loud, particularly if you're a male person in modern society. If you say it, one of two things will happen. Either it'll be like that scene at the end of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where all the snatched people point at the individual, the mouths open, as if you've committed a terrible crime, or you'll be completely ignored, as if you haven't spoken. There's a third, which is you'll be misrepresented as some kind of women-hating monster. But there's no point in arguing about it because nobody pays any attention.
And yet,
that's the whole problem. I spent years arguing about these things as if my opponents were reasonable beings. I discovered they weren't, and so I just what is the? Increasingly, I'm convinced that in a primitive society, someone like me would have been clubbed to death quite early on just for being annoying. As we're no longer in a primitive society, I survived into adulthood, so here I am. But I think there are quite a lot of people who do quietly itch to club me to death because I am irritating, and that's my only role in life now, is irritating them.
Well, I would encourage you not to
certainly
despair.
They're not going to pay any attention.
I'm sure you'll pay no attention to me.
They don't care that I'm right because it doesn't matter. They have the power. So who cares about who's right if you have the power to impose what you want? We have a society of power, not reason, and power allied very, very strongly with the selfish desires of individual human beings, which are indulged and supported by the culture, the academy, the state.
Thank you for watching this episode. If you value vital conversations like this one, please like, share, subscribe, and join the conversation.